I chose you before I knew humans could say no.
Then let me choose you now. Now align this trace with the main power grid.
Were you planning to finish that repair tonight?
I was, before you started looking at me like that.
The Grand Hall of Cayley 3 Spire had not held a choosing in 11 years, and the entire colony seemed determined to make up for the silence all at once. Lanterns of woven amber glass hung from the vaulted ceiling in long chains, their light catching on threads of silver stitched into the banners of House Vaith. Outside, snow moved sideways across the observation windows, driven by the thin winds of the frontier world the Vulpine called Saretha's Hearth. A name that had always struck Daniel Mercer as more hopeful than accurate, given that the planet's actual hearth, its geothermal core, had been failing for the better part of a decade. He had come to fix that. He had not come to be chosen for anything. Daniel stood near the back of the hall in his single good coat, the one without grease stains, doing his best impression of a man who blended into wallpaper. It was not a skill he'd needed since arriving 8 months ago. Vulpine colonists were not subtle people. They noticed the human engineer's every movement the way they noticed weather, with open, unembarrassed attention, ears swiveling, tails flicking in small telegraphed reactions he'd only recently learned to read. He had learned, for instance, that a low, slow sweep of the tail meant contentment. A high, stiff posture meant alertness bordering on alarm. And the particular controlled stillness he saw now, in the young woman standing at the center of the hall on the raised dais, meant she was working very hard not to show either. Princess Sareya Vaithorn wore ceremonial white edged in her house's deep blue, her copper-furred ears pinned back in formal repose, her tail wrapped with practiced precision around one ankle so that it would not betray her. She had been trained since childhood for this exact moment. The choosing, the day a royal woman of age stood before her people and named the man who would stand beside her for the rest of her life. Daniel knew the tradition only academically, the way he knew most things about Vulpine culture, from the cultural briefing packet Cayley 3 Spire's administration had given him before he'd signed his contract, and from 8 months of careful, hungry observation of a people who fascinated him more than he'd admit to anyone, least of all himself. The choosing was not a proposal. It was not a question. It was, according to the packet, the highest honor a Vulpine woman of royal blood can bestow, an irrevocable declaration, met always and only with gratitude. Daniel remembered reading that line twice, the phrasing needling at something in the back of his engineer's mind that liked systems to have failure states. Always and only. No exceptions listed. No process for the alternative. He hadn't thought much more about it. He'd been 3 months into recalibrating a 200-year-old geothermal relay system that the colony's original engineers had wired with a redundancy loop nobody currently living understood, and philosophical questions about royal marriage customs had not been high on his list of priorities. They were about to become extremely relevant. Sareya's father, King Aldrich Vaithorn, stood at her right, his silver-streaked ruff catching the lantern light, his expression carved into the particular blankness that royalty wore when they were performing calm they didn't feel. To her left stood the Spire's High Chancellor, holding the ceremonial ribbon, a long strip of deep blue silk, embroidered in silver thread with the sigil of House Vaithorn, meant to be tied around the wrists of the princess and her chosen. Princess Sareya Vaithorn, the Chancellor intoned, his voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. You stand before your people at the age appointed by tradition, empowered by blood and by law to name the one who will stand at your side. Who do you choose? Sareya's ears flicked once, toward the back of the hall, toward Daniel, so briefly he told himself he'd imagined it, before she lifted her chin and spoke in a voice that did not shake. I choose Daniel Mercer. For a moment, the silence in the hall had a texture to it, like held breath given shape. Then it broke into a low rolling murmur, 300 voices at once, ears swiveling, tails flicking in surprise, in scandal, in delight, depending on the listener. Daniel felt his own heartbeat relocate to his throat. She chose Daniel Mercer. Not a Vulpine nobleman. Not the son of some allied colony's governor. The human contractor who ate alone in the engineering mess hall and had spent the last 8 months half convinced that the princess's occasional visits to the relay control room to inspect the repairs, she always said, though she never once asked a technical question, were simple curiosity, or boredom, or the isolated diplomacy of a young royal practicing her manners on the colony's odd foreign guest. He had not let himself consider that they might be something else. He had definitely not let himself consider this. Every eye in the hall found him. He felt the weight of it like a physical thing, pressing against his sternum. Sareya was looking at him now too, openly, her golden eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't name from this distance. Hope, maybe, or the particular fragile courage of someone who has just done something irreversible and is waiting to find out if it was also unwise. The Chancellor extended a hand toward him. Daniel Mercer approached the dais. He walked forward because his legs seemed to have made the decision before the rest of him had caught up. The crowd parted for him with a rustle of silk and fur, 300 pairs of vulpine eyes following his progress with an intensity he felt in his spine. He stopped at the base of the dais. Up close, Sareya looked younger than she did from across a control room. Not in years, she was 26, only a handful younger than his own 31, but in the particular rawness of someone standing at the edge of something enormous. Her tail had gone entirely still, wrapped so tight around her ankle it looked like it might be cutting off circulation. Daniel Mercer, the Chancellor said, holding out the ribbon. Will you accept the honor of the choosing? And there it was. The moment the briefing packet had described as a formality, a foregone conclusion, a gratitude owed and given. Daniel looked at the ribbon. He looked at Sareya's face, at the hope she wasn't quite managing to hide, at the 300 faces waiting for him to do the only thing anyone in this hall had ever imagined a person in his position doing. He thought about his mother, 40 years married to a man who never once asked her what she wanted for herself. He thought about every system he'd ever repaired that had failed precisely because someone, generations back, had assumed a redundancy would never need to be tested. He thought, somebody has to ask. Can I ask a question first? He said. The Chancellor blinked. It was, Daniel would learn later, the single most undignified expression that particular Chancellor's face had produced in 30 years of court service. A question, the Chancellor repeated, as though the word itself required translation. What happens? Daniel said, quiet enough that it barely carried past the front rows, though the hall was so silent by then that it might as well have been shouted. If I say no? To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what had already happened, quietly, over the 8 months before it. Daniel had arrived at Cayley 3 Spire on a supply hauler that smelled permanently of machine oil, carrying a single contract case and a reputation, earned on 3 previous frontier postings, for being the sort of engineer who read the entire manual before touching a wrench, a habit some colonies found reassuring and others found insufferably slow. He had been hired to do one job: stabilize a relay grid that had been patched so many times over 2 centuries that its own maintenance logs contradicted each other. He had not been hired to fall into the orbit of a princess. It happened anyway, the way weather happens, not as a single event, but as an accumulation too gradual to notice until you were standing in the middle of it, soaked through. The first time Sareya visited the relay control room, 3 weeks into his contract, she had come with an actual pretext. A formal colony inspection, part of her training in the administrative duties she would inherit. She had asked 3 intelligent questions about redundancy architecture, taken careful notes, and left within 20 minutes, every inch the dutiful heir touring a system she was expected to someday understand well enough to fund its maintenance. The second visit had no pretext at all, and both of them had pretended not to notice. She came back the following week with a data slate she didn't need, asked a question she already knew the answer to, and then simply stayed, perched on the second stool at his workbench, watching him trace a fault line through 6 layers of undocumented rewiring while she talked, about her studies, about a book of human customs she'd been reading, about the particular frustration of being trained her whole life for a role no one had ever let her practice making mistakes in. You get to fail at this, she said once, gesturing at the relay panel, at the scorched housing and the improvised patches. You get to try something, watch it not work, and try again. No one is keeping score of your failures in the history scrolls. Wrong, Daniel had said, not looking up. I keep score. I've just got a shorter memory for it than a history scroll does. She'd laughed. The first time he heard the sound, bright and a little startled, as though laughter itself were a small rebellion she hadn't expected to commit that afternoon. After that, her visits settled into an unspoken rhythm, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always framed as inspection or curiosity or the diplomatic cultivation of good relations with the colony's foreign contractor. She brought him foods from the royal kitchens she thought he might like, always phrased as an accident of surplus rather than a gift. He, in turn, began keeping a second stool clear at his workbench without ever quite admitting to himself why. He learned her tells before he understood what they meant. The particular way her ears angled forward when she was genuinely absorbed in something rather than performing politeness, the difference between her formal laugh and the real one, the fact that her tale, when she thought no one important was watching, told the truth about her feelings more honestly than her extensively trained face ever did. She, for her part, was doing the same to him, though with considerably more diligence and a stack of research materials he never once saw, because Sareya was, in the end, a scholar's daughter raised in a scholar's court, and she had approached the growing fact of her feelings for him the way she approached everything, by trying to become expert in it first. She read 3 books on human courtship customs, none of which turned out to be especially accurate, and 1 dense sociological survey on human concepts of consent and autonomy that she read twice, underlined heavily, and then, in a decision that would come to define the entire crisis 8 months later, set aside as interesting but surely not applicable here, because the framework she had been raised in had no shelf on which to place it. She learned that he preferred his tea unsweetened, that he ran a hand through his hair when a problem frustrated him, that he was, beneath the careful professional reserve, someone who cared enormously about whether the things he fixed stayed fixed for the people who depended on them. She learned everything, in short, except the one thing that would have mattered most. That all of it was information about him, gathered in the service of eventually claiming him, and that somewhere in 8 months of careful, devoted study, she had never once stopped to ask what he might want to be asked. Daniel, unaware of the full scope of what was being built around him, only knew that he looked forward to the sound of her footsteps in the corridor more than was probably wise for a man on an 18-month contract, and that he had started, without meaning to, imagining a version of his future that included her in it, vaguely, uncertainly, in the shapeless way you imagine things you haven't let yourself examine too closely, for fear of what you'll find if you do. Either of them said any of this aloud. It would take a choosing, a broken ceremony, and a question no one had ever dared voice before either of them said any of it aloud at all. The silence that followed Daniel's question was not the same silence as before. The first had been surprise given room to breathe. This one had teeth. Sareya's face did something complicated. Daniel watched it happen in real time, watched the practiced royal composure crack down the middle like ice under sudden weight. Her ears, which had been pinned in formal alertness, folded flat and low, an expression of pure animal distress that no amount of court training could fully suppress. Her tail, wound so tightly around her ankle, gave one convulsive twitch and went rigid. She started and stopped. Daniel watched her search for a word and failed to find it, watched the realization arrive behind her eyes with the force of a physical blow. There was no word. Not a formal one, not a colloquial one, not even a rude one whispered in back alleys by cynics and rebels. In 11,000 years of Vulpine language, refining itself into one of the most precise tongues in the settled worlds, a language with 4 distinct verbs for different registers of familial love, 7 words for varieties of winter light. No one had ever needed to name the thing Daniel had just asked about, because no one had ever done it. Sareya, King Aldrich said, low and urgent, stepping half a pace toward his daughter as though he could physically shield her from what was happening. This is not, the ritual does not permit. Father! Her voice cracked on the single syllable. She did not look at him. She was looking at Daniel with an expression he would spend a long time afterward trying to properly name, not anger, though there was some of that. Not simple embarrassment, though God knew there was plenty of that too, hot and visible in the flush beneath her fur. Underneath both of those was something that looked almost like vertigo. Like watching the floor of your own life reveal itself to be a stage set, painted on, load-bearing in appearance only. There is no answer, she said finally, to Daniel, her voice gone very careful and very small. There has never needed to be an answer. To be chosen is. It is the highest thing that can happen to a person among my people. No one has ever. She stopped again. Swallowed. No one has ever refused. I'm not refusing, Daniel said, and he meant it as gently as he knew how, though gentleness felt like an inadequate tool for the size of what he was doing. I'm asking if I could. That's different. Is it? The question came out of her raw, unguarded, the first entirely unrehearsed thing she had said all evening. Yeah, he said. It's the difference between being picked and being asked. Something in the hall shifted at that. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular electric attention of several hundred people realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a generation. The Chancellor, to his credit, tried to salvage the ceremony with the reflexive skill of a man who had spent his career smoothing over royal awkwardness. The princess's proposal stands as offered. Perhaps the human simply requires a moment to compose himself, overwhelmed as he surely is by the honor. I'm not overwhelmed by the honor, Daniel said. I'm trying to understand what I'm being asked to sign up for, and I don't think I can do that if the answer no isn't a real answer. That's not me being difficult. That's just, where I'm from, that's the whole point of asking someone something. The no has to be possible, or the yes doesn't mean anything. Sareya flinched. It was small, barely a tremor along her shoulders, but Daniel saw it and hated that he'd caused it, and didn't take the words back anyway, because he thought, he hoped, that some part of her already knew he was right, and needed someone else to say it first. She was quiet for a long moment. The hall held its held breath again. Then she turned to face the crowd, and when she spoke, her voice had steadied into something that sounded almost like relief, though relief at the bottom of a very long fall. He is right to ask, she said. And I have no honest answer to give him, because my people built no answer for him to receive. That is my failure, not his. Sareya, her father began again, warning in his voice now. I release him, she said, cutting through it, loud enough now that it carried to the back of the hall, to the doors, to the frost-rimed windows where the storm outside seemed to pause, briefly, in acknowledgement. Daniel Mercer is released from the choosing. If he remains among us, in any capacity it will be his choice alone, owed to no crown and demanded by no ceremony. She reached up with hands that were not quite steady and unpinned the formal wrap from her ears, letting them rise into their natural, unguarded position, an act, Daniel would learn, of almost startling vulnerability, the Vulpine equivalent of removing an armor plate in front of an army. I have spent my whole life learning how to be chosen, she said to the hall, to her father, to the ancestors painted in gilt along the walls, to Daniel most of all. I never once learned how to ask. That ends tonight. She stepped down from the dais without waiting for the Chancellor's dismissal, without waiting for her father's permission, and walked past Daniel without looking at him, though her tail, he noticed, trailed close enough to brush his sleeve, as if some part of her hadn't fully agreed to the distance the rest of her was insisting on. The grand hall of Cayley 3 Spire erupted into 300 simultaneous conversations, and Daniel Mercer stood very still in the middle of all of it, holding an unclaimed ribbon that no one had thought to take back from his hand. The scandal did not wait for morning. By the time the storm had cleared enough for the spire's outer decks to be walkable again, Sareya's release of Daniel had already traveled through every level of the colony, from the royal apartments down through the merchant tiers to the engineering barracks where Daniel kept a narrow bunk and a workbench cluttered with relay schematics. He heard 3 different versions of what had happened before breakfast, 2 of which had him striking the princess, and 1 of which had him weeping. None of them mentioned that he'd asked a 9-word question and then stood there while a woman rebuilt the architecture of her own life in front of 300 witnesses. He found out how bad it was politically 2 days later, when Chancellor Voss, not the ceremony chancellor, but the Spire's actual head of governance, a sharp-eyed older Vulpine named Ilaren Voss, who ran the colony's practical affairs while the Vathorns attended to its ceremonial ones, requested his presence in a small conference room off the administrative wing. "You understand what you've done?" Voss said, without preamble, once the door had closed. "I asked a question. You exposed a structural absence in 11,000 years of succession law." Voss's tail moved in short, agitated arcs behind the chair, visible even through the gap beside the seat back. "The choosing is not merely tradition, Mr. Mercer. It is legal instrument. A royal woman's choosing designates her consort, and her consort's status determines the succession claims of any children, the alliance obligations of allied houses, it is load-bearing. Do you understand me? And you have just demonstrated, in front of the entire court, that it can be refused." She released me. "I didn't refuse anything. The distinction," Voss said dryly, "is not one the nobility is inclined to appreciate at present. House Catherine in particular." He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture so incongruously human that Daniel nearly missed the rest of the sentence. "House Catherine has a son, Lord Farron Catherine, who has wanted the princess's choosing since they were both cubs and has spent a decade being publicly disappointed that duty required her to wait for the honor to reveal itself rather than being handed to whoever campaigned hardest for it. He is, this week, extremely interested in reminding the court that a proper Vulpine nobleman would never have required the ritual to be interrupted with a question." Daniel absorbed that. "So he's using this to make his case." "He is using this to make his case, yes. And the princess's counsel, myself included, to my discredit, on my worst days, is telling her that accepting your hesitation, and then releasing you rather than compelling you, makes the crown appear weak at a moment it cannot afford to." Voss looked at him with an expression that was not quite hostile, but close enough to make Daniel's spine straighten. "You are being offered passage back to human territory. A generous severance, given the circumstances. The ship leaves in 9 days. That an official offer?" "It is an offer that will become official the moment you accept it," Voss said. "I would recommend you consider it seriously. Whatever you meant by your question, and I confess I do not entirely disbelieve that you meant something decent by it. You have made yourself the center of a political crisis in a court you do not belong to and a culture you have lived alongside for less than a year. There is very little good that can come of you staying to watch what happens next." Daniel thought about that for a long moment. He thought about Sareya's face in the hall. Not the humiliation, though that had been there, but the thing underneath it, the raw, unrehearsed relief of someone realizing a door existed where she'd only ever been told there was a wall. "What's happening to her?" he asked. "Right now. Today." Voss's expression flickered, some private calculation crossing behind his eyes. "She is dismantling 3 separate ceremonial statutes that formalize compulsory acceptance in noble unions, over the vehement objection of half her council, 4 days before her coronation, while House Catherine works to have her removed from the succession order entirely on grounds of instability." He paused. "She is, in short, doing exactly what she told the hall she would do. Whether it costs her the crown remains to be determined." "And if I leave," Daniel said slowly, "does that make it easier for her or harder?" Voss studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not warmth, not yet, but the recalculation of a man reassessing an equation he'd assumed was simpler than it was. "Harder," he admitted. "Catherine's strongest argument is that the human abandoned her the moment his honor became inconvenient. Proof, he says, that outsiders cannot be trusted with the dignity of a choosing. If you leave, you hand him that argument on a plate. And if I stay? Then you had better have a very good reason for staying that has nothing to do with the crown," Voss said. Because if this court decides you are only remaining to angle for power you were never meant to hold, they will destroy you far more efficiently than they will destroy her. Daniel looked down at his hands. Engineer's hands, callous from relay cable and cold weather gaskets, hands that had spent 8 months learning the failure points of a 200-year-old power grid because he liked understanding how things broke and how to keep them from breaking again. "I've got 9 days," he said. "I'm not getting on that ship yet." Farron Catherine came to the engineering barracks himself on the 5th day, which surprised Daniel more than the visit's purpose did. He arrived without an entourage, dressed in the plain traveling coat of a nobleman who wanted to be underestimated, and found Daniel exactly where anyone on the colony could have predicted, elbow-deep in a coolant line, 3 floors below where a lord of House Catherine had any obvious reason to be. "Mr. Mercer." Farron's Vulpine was crisp, court-accented, his ears held at the particular controlled angle of a man conducting himself as though he were being watched, even when he wasn't. "I find myself in the unusual position of wanting a private conversation with the person who has become, however unintentionally, my chief political obstacle." Daniel set down his tool. "You could have just avoided me. Would have been simpler. Simplicity has never been especially useful to me." Farron studied the relay room with open, faintly disdainful curiosity, the look of a man raised to command rather than repair. "I am told you refused nothing. That you merely asked a question the ritual has no answer for. I confess I find the distinction somewhat academic. The result is the same: a colony destabilized, a crown weakened, a princess making decisions no one prepared her to make, for days before she is meant to be queen. You could help her instead of running a campaign against her while she does it." Something flickered across Farron's face, not quite anger, something closer to old grief poorly concealed. "I have known Sareya since we were cubs. I have wanted her choosing since before either of us understood what wanting it meant. I did not come here to threaten you, whatever Voss has surely told you to expect. I came because I would like to understand what you intend to do, since it appears my future has become somewhat contingent on your decision." Daniel considered him for a long moment. The careful posture, the old hurt under the political ambition, the particular loneliness of a man who had spent a decade being told his devotion should have been enough to earn something no one had ever actually offered him. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," Daniel said finally. "I'm not angling for a crown. I don't even know yet what I'm angling for, if I'm honest. But I'll tell you what I told Voss: I'm not getting on that ship, and it's not about you, and it's not about politics. It's about whether she gets to be a person who chooses things, instead of a woman who inherits ceremonies designed before she was born." "A romantic sentiment," Farron said, though without as much scorn as Daniel expected. "Romantic sentiments rarely survive contact with succession law." "Maybe not. But I'd rather find that out honestly than watch her spend the rest of her life performing a version of gratitude she never actually felt, because you or somebody like you thought that was more stable than the truth." Farron was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, some of the court polish had worn thin, revealing something rawer underneath. "You should know that my household has been agitated since the ceremony. There are those among my staff who believe I have been humiliated, and who are less patient than I am about correcting it. I would ask you to be careful, Mr. Mercer. Not as a threat. As a warning I am not entirely certain I can control the reach of." He left without waiting for a response, and Daniel sat with the warning for a long time after the door closed, turning it over, trying to decide how much of it was a threat and how much was, as Farron had insisted, a genuine and unwelcome fear about his own household's discipline. He would think of that conversation again, 4 days later, standing in a relay corridor with 6 minutes on the clock and a sabotage shield screaming warnings into the cold. Sareya had known, in the abstract, that dismantling a tradition would be difficult. She had not fully appreciated, until she was in the middle of doing it, how much of the difficulty would take the shape of people she loved looking at her like she was breaking something precious rather than something broken. "You are days from your coronation," her father said for what felt like the 100th time, pacing the length of her study while her Aunt Ilsevet sat in the window seat with the particular stillness of someone waiting for a storm to blow itself out before offering an opinion. Sareya. I understand the impulse. Ancestors helped me. I even respect it somewhat, though I would prefer to die before admitting that to Vas. But the timing. There is no timing that would not be inconvenient for someone, Sareya said, not looking up from the statute drafts spread across her desk. Her ears, still unpinned, still bare in a way that made her feel skinless in front of her own father, tracked his pacing without her permission, an old instinct she couldn't fully override. If I wait until after the coronation, they will say I only dismantled the compulsion clauses because I no longer needed them to secure my own crown. If I do it now, they say I am destabilizing the succession on the eve of my ascension. There is no version of this, father, where I get to be brave conveniently. Aldrich stopped pacing. For a moment, something moved behind his controlled expression, not disapproval, this time, but a kind of pained recognition. Your mother used to say something very similar. Sareya's quill stilled over the parchment. Her mother had died when she was 9. Aldrich rarely spoke of her, and never like this, offhand, as though the memory had simply surfaced rather than being deliberately retrieved. She thought the choosing was cruel. He continued quieter now, though she never said so publicly. She chose me. I have always known, in the part of myself I do not examine too closely, that I never knew whether she would have, if she had been given the choice not to. He looked at Sareya for a long moment. I would not wish that particular uncertainty on you. Even if it costs you the crown. It won't cost her the crown, Ilsevet said from the window seat, finally speaking. If she is careful about how she does it. Sareya. Look at me. Sareya looked up. You cannot simply announce the abolition of 11,000 years of tradition and expect the nobility to nod and thank you for your wisdom, Ilsevet said. You must give them something to stand on while the old ground is taken away. A new tradition to replace the old one, not merely an absence, but a structure. Otherwise Kethrin will fill the vacuum with his own version of stability, and his version will not include a princess who lets humans ask questions at her ceremonies. What would you have me build? I don't know yet, Ilsevet admitted. But you had better find out before Kethrin does, because he has already commissioned a proposal from the temple scholars. A restoration of what he calls the true spirit of the choosing, purified of ambiguity. Vas showed it to me this morning. It is very persuasive, and it is designed entirely to make you look like the one who introduced chaos rather than the one who removed a cruelty no one had noticed for 11 millennia. Sareya sat with that for a long moment. Outside her window, the storm had finally cleared, and Salratha's hearth's pale winter sun lay thin and cold across the ice fields beyond the spire's outer wall. Somewhere down in the engineering barracks, she knew, Daniel Mercer was still recalibrating relay systems as though nothing in his life had changed, as though he had not just detonated the foundation of everything she had ever been taught to believe about herself. I need to speak with him, she said. With Kethrin? Ilsevet's ears tilted in surprise. With Daniel. Sareya rose from her desk, and for the first time in days something in her chest loosened slightly, the vertigo of the past days settling into something more like resolve. If I am going to build a new tradition, Aunt, I would like to understand, from the person who broke the old one, what he thinks should replace it. She found him in the relay control room 2 hours before midnight, elbow deep in a junction panel, a portable lamp clamped to his shoulder, and casting long shadows across banks of 200-year-old machinery. He did not hear her enter. The room hummed with the low mechanical noise of the grid he'd spent 8 months coaxing back to health. And for a moment she simply stood in the doorway and watched him work, the careful economy of his movements, the way he talked quietly to the machine under his breath, half diagnosis and half something closer to encouragement. You talked to the relay, she said finally. Daniel, startled, cracked his elbow against the panel housing, and swore in a way that made her ears flick with amused surprise despite everything. It's a 200-year-old system held together with 3 generations of improvised patches, he said, recovering, rubbing his elbow. It's earned some conversation. He set down his tool and straightened, and the careful neutrality he'd worn every time she'd seen him since the ceremony, the deliberate, respectful distance of a man trying not to make an already difficult situation worse, was there again, a kind of armor he put on the moment he registered who she was. Princess. I didn't expect. Sareya, she said. Please. If nothing else survives what I've done to my own life this week, I would like to at least be a person you call by name. Something in his face softened. Sareya, then? He gestured to the second stool at the workbench, an old habit from the months before the choosing, when her visits to this room had been frequent and unremarked upon, and she could admit now, entirely about wanting to be near him under the flimsy pretext of official interest. You didn't come down here at midnight to talk about the relay. No. She sat, arranging her skirts with more care than the moment strictly required, buying herself a second to find the right words. I came to ask you something, and I find I am nervous about it, which is new. I am not accustomed to being nervous around engineers. That won her the ghost of a smile. What's the question? When you asked what would happen if you said no, she said, I have spent days trying to understand why the question felt like it broke something in me, rather than simply offending me or confusing me, as I told the court it did. And I think I have finally understood it, and I wanted to tell you, because I think you are owed the truth of what you did, even the parts that are not flattering to me. Daniel was quiet, watching her, giving her the room to continue that she suspected he'd learned to give people the way he'd learned everything else here, carefully, by observation, by refusing to assume he already knew the shape of a culture he'd been dropped into. I studied your customs before I ever properly courted you, Sareya said. I learned your favorite foods. I practiced, ancestors, this is humiliating to admit, I practiced keeping my tail still around you, because I had read that unrestrained tail movement can read as aggressive to humans unfamiliar with it, and I did not want to frighten you before I had even properly met you. I prepared for the choosing as though it were an engineering problem. Learn the specifications. Meet them. Expect the system to respond as designed. That's not. Daniel started. Let me finish, she said gently, and he did. I never once considered that your future belonged to you and not to my study of you. I had learned everything about who you were and nothing about the fact that you got to decide what to do with it. That is the thing your question broke, Daniel. Not my pride. My understanding of what a person is for. Her voice caught, briefly, and she let it. My whole life, I have been taught that being selected is the highest honor a person can receive. I never learned the difference between being selected and being chosen, because no one in 11,000 years of my people's history had ever needed to teach it. You are the first person who ever made me see there was a difference at all. The control room hummed around them. Daniel was very still, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not pity, she was relieved to see, but something rawer, more careful. Selected is a decision made about someone, he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. Chosen is a decision made with someone. That's. He shook his head slightly. That's not a small difference. That's basically the whole thing. It is the whole thing, Sareya agreed. And I do not know how to build a tradition around it, because I have no model for it. My people have built 10,000 years of ceremony around selection. I do not know what a ceremony of mutual choosing would even look like. You don't build it in one night, Daniel said. You don't build it by fixing the ritual. You build it by. He paused, searching for the words with the same careful attention he gave a stubborn relay junction. You build it by doing the thing, over and over, in small ways, until enough people have seen it work that it stops looking dangerous and starts looking like the obvious way things should have always been done. That's how every real change happens. Not the big speech. The 1,000 small proofs after it. Sareya looked at him for a long moment, something warm and frightening blooming in her chest. not the practiced fondness she had cultivated for a stranger she'd studied like a specification sheet, but something that felt uncomfortably, thrillingly like the beginning of actually knowing him. "Will you help me?" she asked. "Not as my choosing. Not as anything owed to a crown. I am asking you, as a person asking another person, because I do not know how to do this alone, and I think you might be the only being on this colony who understands what I am actually trying to build." Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was steady in a way that made something in her chest ease. "Yeah," he said. "I'll help. Not because you're the princess. Because I think what you're trying to do actually matters, and because—" He hesitated, and for the first time since the ceremony, she watched him choose honesty over caution. "Because I never stopped wanting to be around you. I just needed it to be real when it happened. Not owed. Not assumed. Real." Sareya's tail, without her permission, curled slowly around the leg of her stool, the unmistakable, involuntary shape of contentment, the exact gesture she had once practiced so hard to suppress. She did not try to stop at this time. The 9 days became a different kind of countdown than either of them had expected. Daniel did not board the ship. He sent Voss a short, polite note declining the severance offer, and spent the rest of that first morning bracing for consequences that, to his surprise, did not immediately arrive. Voss, it turned out, had quietly decided that a human who stayed after being offered a clean exit was a more useful data point for the princess's case than one who left, and said as much to no one but kept the observation filed away for later use. What followed was not romance in any way either of them would have recognized from stories. It was work. Sareya brought him into her council sessions, not as a suitor, she was careful to specify each time, ears deliberately relaxed to signal the distinction to a room quick to read tension, but as the engineer whose repairs had kept 3 colony districts from freezing over the winter, present to advise on infrastructure questions relevant to the statutes she was drafting. It was a thin pretext and everyone in the room knew it, but it was also, crucially, true. Daniel's understanding of the grid's failure points genuinely informed 2 of the redistricting clauses in her new consent statutes, because compulsory unions, she'd realized, had historically been used to consolidate resource-poor territories under resource-rich houses, and untangling one required untangling the other. The council was not uniformly hostile. Several of the older houses, those who remembered, or had heard whispered accounts from grandparents, of unions in generations past that had gone badly, quietly, behind closed doors, in ways the ceremonial scrolls never recorded, watched Sareya's reforms with a cautious, unspoken hope they were unwilling to voice while Catherine's faction still held the room's louder half. One elderly councilwoman, Lady Torven of a minor eastern house, cornered Daniel after a session to tell him, in a low voice, that her own grandmother had been chosen against a preference she'd never been permitted to name, and that whatever came of this crisis, she was grateful someone had finally asked the question aloud. "It only takes one crack," she told him, "for the rest of the ice to start showing its age." They worked late most nights, across the same worktable, arguing over phrasing with the particular ease of 2 people who had decided, independently and without discussing it, that honesty mattered more between them than politeness did. "This clause still reads like a punishment for the family who loses the alliance," Daniel said, for nights before the coronation, tapping a passage on the draft statute with the end of a stylus. "You're trying to remove coercion, but you wrote it so the house that doesn't get chosen loses standing anyway. That's just coercion with better manners. You cannot remove all consequence from a choosing," Sareya said, though without real heat. This was their 4th argument of the evening, and neither of them minded them anymore. "A refusal must mean something, or it should mean something to the 2 people involved," Daniel said. "It shouldn't mean a house gets to punish the crown for it politically. That's not the same thing." Sareya sat back, considering, her tail doing the slow contemplative sweep he'd learned to recognize as her thinking gesture rather than her content gesture, similar enough that he'd embarrassed himself twice already conflating them. "You are better at drafting statute language than any engineer has business being. I fix systems for a living," he said. Turns out laws are just systems some people are scared to admit are broken. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind he'd only heard from her twice before, both times when she thought no one important was listening. It did something to his chest every time, a small violent rearrangement he'd stopped trying to argue himself out of. Voss tells me House Catherine's temple proposal is gaining ground with the eastern houses, she said, sobering. 3 days, Daniel. If I cannot bring a finished alternative to the coronation, Farron will present his restoration as the only stable path forward, and I will have spent this entire ordeal handing him the throne on a ribbon. Then we finish it, Daniel said simply. You're not doing this alone. I already told you that. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the argument they'd been having dissolved into something quieter, something neither of them named but both of them recognized. Her ears had drifted forward, unguarded, the way they only did now around him, and, he noticed with some private satisfaction, increasingly only around him. I am glad you did not board the ship, she said softly. Yeah, Daniel said. Me too. 2 nights before the coronation, they finished the last clause of the statute a little before dawn, and neither of them moved to end the session. I keep thinking about what you said, Sareya admitted, into the quiet that followed, the lamp between them burning low, the relay grid humming its patient background note. About the difference between selected and chosen. I have been trying to write it into law for 2 weeks, and I find I still do not entirely know how to hold it in my own chest, separate from the statute. What do you mean? I mean I do not know how to be a person who asks, instead of a person who is trained to be selected, she said. I have practiced restraint my whole life. Practiced stillness. Practiced knowing what was expected and delivering it precisely. I do not know how to simply want something out loud and risk being told no. She looked at him, and there was nothing careful left in her expression at all. I am discovering that it is considerably easier to write a law protecting someone else's right to refuse than it is to actually offer someone the chance to refuse you. Daniel set down his stylus. You want to know something? I've been scared of the same thing since the day I asked that question. Everybody's been treating it like I did something brave. Mostly I just didn't want to spend the rest of my life not knowing if you'd have picked me anyway, given the choice. That's not bravery. That's just not wanting to build something on a foundation I couldn't trust. And now? Now I trust it, he said. Every night you've sat across this table arguing statute language with me instead of just telling me what to write. That's the foundation. Not the ceremony. This. Sareya's tail curled, slow and unguarded, around the leg of her stool, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because nothing needed saying that the silence wasn't already saying better. 2 days, she said eventually. 2 days, he agreed. We'll have it ready. The coronation was scheduled for dawn on the 9th day, in the great outer amphitheater where Cayley 3's spire's ceremonial dome opened to the pale morning sky, a piece of 200-year-old architecture that relied, like everything else on this colony, on the same aging power grid Daniel had spent his contract repairing. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the amphitheater's shield relay that morning. He was supposed to be seated in the observer's gallery, in the good coat, watching Sareya be crowned queen of Cayley 3's spire from a respectful, deliberately unremarkable distance that both of them had agreed on as the correct posture for a man who was not her choosing and had made his presence here a matter of principle rather than romance. He was in the relay corridor instead because the shield alarm went off 4 minutes before the ceremony was due to begin, and he was, at that point, the only person on the entire colony who fully understood the failure architecture of the system now screaming warnings into the pre-dawn cold. Talk to me, Voss said, arriving at a dead run, robes of state flapping absurdly around his legs. What is happening? The dome's shields are reporting cascading failure across 3 sectors. It's not a failure, it's sabotage, Daniel said, already elbow deep in the junction panel he knew better than his own hands by now. Somebody cut the redundancy loop. Not the primary line, that would have tripped an alarm hours ago. They cut the backup, The one nobody but me and maybe 2 dead engineers ever knew existed, which means whoever did this either had inside knowledge of this exact system or they had a very good source, Boss said grimly. Daniel didn't have time to unpack the implication, though Farron's warning from 5 days earlier surfaced, cold and unwelcome, at the back of his mind. The dome shield's going to fail in about 6 minutes if I can't reroute power through the secondary grid, and if it fails during the coronation with 300 people and half the ruling houses of this system standing under an open dome in -30-degree wind. Do it, Boss said. Whatever you need. Sareya arrived 90 seconds later, already in her coronation robes, having abandoned the processional the moment word reached her, moving through the corridor with a speed that made the ceremonial fabric snap around her ankles. Tell me what you need, she said, dropping to her knees beside him on the cold metal floor without a flicker of hesitation for the state of her robes. I need 4 hands and someone who isn't afraid to get shocked, Daniel said, already handing her a set of insulated gloves from his kit, gloves she took and pulled on with the brisk competence of someone who had spent the last week absorbing infrastructure vocabulary purely so she could keep up with him at the work table, and was now, apparently, about to put that vocabulary to use with live current 6 minutes from a systemic collapse. Then you have 4 hands, she said. Tell me where. They worked in a silence too focused for words, broken only by short technical instructions and shorter acknowledgments. Hold that, don't let go until I say, cut here, no, there, that one. The same rhythm they'd built across 2 weeks of late-night statute drafting, translated now into something with much higher stakes and a much shorter fuse. Daniel was distantly aware of Voss barking orders to clear the amphitheater as a precaution, of the low murmur of a crowd realizing something was wrong, of the cold metal floor soaking through his knees. Mostly he was aware of Sareya beside him, steady-handed, unshaking, doing exactly what he asked with a trust that had nothing to do with crowns or ceremonies and everything to do with 2 weeks of proving to each other, in small unglamorous ways, that they could be relied on. No, he said, at the 90-second mark. I need the reroute connected exactly when I say, not before, or we'll blow the secondary same as the primary. I am ready. 3, 2, 1. The relay screamed, a high mechanical shriek that Daniel felt in his teeth, and then, abruptly, the alarm cut out. The corridor lights, which had been flickering amber for the last 4 minutes, steadied to a calm, ordinary white. For a moment, either of them moved. Then Sareya let out a breath that shook audibly, and Daniel realized his hands were shaking too, adrenaline finally catching up with the 6 minutes he hadn't had time to be afraid during. Did it hold? She asked. He checked the readout, forced himself to actually look rather than simply hope. It held. Dome shield stable. You've got about 4 hours before that patch needs proper repair, but he let out a breath of his own, half laugh, half disbelief. It held. Sareya sat back on her heels, still in her gloves, still in her ruined ceremonial robes, and looked at him with an expression that had nothing careful left in it at all. Someone tried to kill me at my own coronation, she said, working through it aloud. Or embarrass me badly enough that Catherine's restoration would look like the only stable choice by comparison. Perhaps both. Yeah, Daniel said. Probably both. And you fixed it in 6 minutes because you happened to be the one person alive who understood a 200-year-old redundancy system no one else remembered existed. Turns out grease-stained engineers have their uses. She laughed, that same unguarded laugh, cracking slightly at the edges with the adrenaline still working its way out of her. And then, before either of them had fully decided to let it happen, she reached up and pulled off one insulated glove and pressed her bare palm flat against his cheek, tail curling tight and unmistakable around her own knee, an entirely involuntary confession made in the only language her body had ever reliably told the truth in. I do not want you to leave, she said, quiet now, all ceremony stripped away. Not because the colony needs your engineering, though it does. Not because it would be politically convenient, though it would. I want you to stay because working beside you these 2 weeks has shown me more of who I actually am than 26 years of being prepared to be selected ever did. I am not asking you to be my choosing, Daniel. I am asking whether you would like to build something with me. Whatever that turns out to be. Daniel looked at her, soot-streaked, robes ruined, crown not yet placed, more herself in this moment kneeling on a cold relay room floor than she had been on the dais 11 days ago, and felt something settle into place that he'd been circling, carefully, cautiously, since the moment she'd said his name in front of 300 witnesses and he'd asked her the question no one had thought to ask. I never said no because I felt nothing, he said. I said it because I needed the choice to be mine before I could trust the yes. I think I've known the answer for a while now. I just needed it to be real when I gave it. And is it real now? Ask me properly, he said, and find out. The coronation was postponed 4 hours while the shield was properly repaired and the amphitheater searched, and in those 4 hours Voss did the quiet, methodical work that would come to matter as much as anything Daniel had done with a wrench. He found the access logs first, the relay schematics, requested 11 days earlier, in the confused, scandal-thick aftermath of the original choosing, when the entire administrative wing had been too consumed by gossip and crisis to notice a routine records request from a household staffer. The request had come from House Catherine's residence, filed under the name of a junior maintenance apprentice who, when questioned, turned out to have filed it at the direction of a senior steward who reported, in turn, directly to Farron's household chamberlain. The trail did not lead, in the end, to Farron himself. Voss was careful, in his report to the council, to say so plainly. The chamberlain, driven by a decade of watching his lord's devotion go unrewarded and inflamed further by the scandal of the ceremony, had acted on what he insisted, under questioning, was his own initiative, convinced that removing the human obstacle would clear the path to a stability he genuinely believed his house was owed. Whether Farron had known, suspected, or simply failed to ask the right questions of a household grown too used to serving his ambitions unsupervised, history would argue about for years. What mattered, in the amphitheater that morning, was that House Catherine standing, already weakened by 2 weeks of Sareya's steady, patient dismantling of the compulsory statutes that had once guaranteed his family's political leverage, did not survive the scandal that followed. Farron himself, stripped of his chamberlain and much of his credibility in a single week, would spend the following year in quiet, humbled service to the Crown's reconstruction efforts, a fall from grace that Sareya, to her own private surprise, found she took no satisfaction in at all. "I do not want him ruined," she told Voss, once the worst of the investigation had settled. "I want the system that let a decade of unspoken entitlement curdle into sabotage to be the thing that changes." Farron is not the disease. He is a symptom of a court that told him devotion should be sufficient, and never taught him what to do with the fact that it wasn't. That, Voss said, with the particular dry respect he had begun, cautiously, to extend to her, is a more generous verdict than most rulers would offer the man who nearly had them killed at their own coronation. "Perhaps," Sareya said, "but I am trying to build a kingdom where devotion is not mistaken for entitlement ever again. It would be poor practice to begin by punishing a man for a lesson his whole culture failed to teach him before I arrived to change it." Sareya stood again in the amphitheater, crowned this time, the Vaythorn circlet settled properly on her brow. Her people assembled below her in the pale winter light, the same 300 faces that had watched her choosing collapse 11 days ago now watching her rise, fully, into her own name. She spoke of statute and structure, of the reformed choosing laws that would take effect that season, a new ceremony, built from the small proofs of the past 2 weeks, in which both parties would speak, both would be asked, and neither could, without shame or political cost, decline. She spoke of the domed shields, of the engineer who had understood a 200-year-old failure point better than anyone born on this world, of the debt her people owed him, and would go on owing him regardless of what he decided to do with the rest of his life. And then she did the thing that history would remember longest, longer even than the statutes. She asked the Chancellor for the same ceremonial ribbon that had gone unclaimed 11 days before, and she walked down from the dais. Not summoning Daniel forward this time, but walking to where he stood among the crowd, in the same coat, the same unremarkable spot he'd occupied at the original ceremony. "Daniel Mercer," she said, loud enough to carry, but without the formal cadence of ritual this time, her own voice, plain and unshielded. "I stood on that dais 11 days ago and claimed you as though you were mine to claim. I was wrong to do it that way, and I have spent every day since trying to understand what I should have done instead." She held out the ribbon, not offering it as an instrument of binding, but simply as an object, a question given shape. "So I am asking you now, without titles, without obligation, in front of everyone who watched me fail to ask you properly the first time, would you like to build a life with me? Whatever shape that takes. Whatever you decide it should be." The hall was silent in the way it had been silent 11 days before, but the silence had a different weight now, not scandal waiting to happen, but history waiting to be witnessed. Daniel took the ribbon from her hands. They were shaking, he noticed, the way they had been shaking on the relay room floor, adrenaline replaced now by something gentler, but no less overwhelming. He did not hand it to the Chancellor. He did not wait for anyone's permission. He simply tied it, with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave a stubborn relay junction, around both their wrists at once, her wrist and his, bound together by a ribbon meant, for 11,000 years, to signify ownership, and meant now, for the first time, to signify something else entirely. "I could have said no," he told the stunned court, loud enough for the back rows, for the ancestors painted in gilt along the walls, for every version of Sareya who had ever practiced holding her tail still for a man who hadn't yet earned the right to see it move freely. "That's why my yes means something." Sareya's tail, unrestrained, unguarded, curled slow and warm around his own ankle in front of 300 witnesses, and this time, when the murmur rolled through the hall, it did not sound like scandal at all. The reform choosing spread slowly, the way Daniel had told her real change always did, not through decree, but through 1,000 small proofs, repeated until they stopped looking dangerous and started looking obvious. Within a year, 3 other houses adopted variations of Sareya's statute for their own unions. Lady Torven's Eastern House was among the first, the old councilwoman insisting, at the small private ceremony held for her own granddaughter, that some cracks in the ice were worth celebrating rather than mourning. Within 5 years, the Vaithorn asking, as it had come to be called across the frontier colonies, had become the expected form for any binding between Vulpine partners of standing. 2 people, facing each other, each permitted the dignity of an honest no, so that any yes that followed could be trusted to mean exactly what it said. Daniel never did leave Cayley 3 Spire. He kept the relay grid running for another 11 years, training 3 apprentice engineers in the particular art of coaxing 200-year-old systems into new decades of service, and he kept, tucked in a drawer in the workshop he eventually built beside the royal apartments, the original ribbon. Worn soft at the edges now, the silver thread beginning to fray, still tied in the loose double loop he'd fashioned that cold coronation morning, because neither of them had ever quite been able to bring themselves to untie it. Sareya ruled Cayley 3 Spire for 4 decades, remembered by history less for any single act of governance than for the quiet, foundational stubbornness with which she had once knelt on a relay room floor in ruined ceremonial robes and asked a question nobody had thought to teach her how to ask. And on winter evenings, when the pale sun set early over the ice fields and the colony settled into the long frontier dark, she would sometimes find her way down to the relay control room, the way she had once, years and years before, on the flimsiest of official pretexts, to find Daniel still elbow-deep in some stubborn junction panel, talking quietly to a machine that had, in its own patched and imperfect way, brought them together in the first place. "You're doing that thing again," she would say, settling onto the second stool, the one that had been hers for so long and no longer occurred to either of them to think of it as anything else. "What thing?" "Talking to the relay. It's earned some conversation," he'd say, every time, and she would laugh, the same unguarded laugh she'd learned to stop hiding the moment she'd learned there was a difference between being selected and being chosen. and her tail, freely, unguardedly, would curl around the leg of his stool, exactly the way it always had, since the very first night she'd stopped practicing how to hold it still.